Hello and welcome everyone to this edition of Beyond the Classroom at Ashoka's seminar series that have been organized by the Ashoka X group to essentially give everyone here an introduction to our faculty, our subjects, how we teach, what we like to teach, etc. And tonight, my colleague Swargajyoti Gohain is joining me from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Her work is extremely fascinating. Her talk today is on everyday life in the Himalayas. And if I understand Swargajyoti's work, I think she uses communities who live in these sort of uppermost mountain reaches of the Himalayas to talk about their role in the geopolitics of the region and just how sometimes they're a neglected group, even though they're so critical to the security, the ecological balance, the cultural balance, and of course the national security impact on those areas. So before going on too much, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Gohain. She's an assistant professor of sociology and anthropology, as I said, and she works on issues of borders, states, identity, development, and infrastructure in the Himalayas. Over to you.
Thank you, Maya. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the introduction. And I also thank the Ashoka X team for this event. I'm very happy to be talking about a subject that is, so dear to me, but my research. And today I'll be talking about everyday life in the Himalayas. Shall I start my screen share?
Sure, I think so. You can go ahead.
Okay. So my topic is everyday life in the Himalayas. And today, of course, I'm not going to talk about the Himalayas as a geological space. I'm going to talk about the people of the Himalayas. And I'm going to start by looking at different views about the Himalayas. And I will distinguish between two views. One I call the romantic Himalayas, and the other I call the lived Himalayas. So there have been different, views about the Himalayas, different perceptions and common sensical assumptions about the Himalayas. And often we find that the Himalayas are considered to be this very exotic place, very remote, isolated. It's a mystical place, the mystical Himalayas, the sacred Himalayas, the unexplored paradise. So these are some common themes by which we commonly understand the Himalayas. And this is not innocent, of course. This is product of a deliberate representation of the Himalayas, which stem from colonial, encounters with the Himalayas. And the other view that I will be talking about is called the lived Himalayas, where I'll be looking at how the Himalayas, when we look at the lived experience of the people in the Himalayas and how their daily lives are, and how their daily lives are structured around the border location, how geopolitics, international relations between India, China, US, China, Nepal, all these international relations also contribute and impact lives in the Himalayas. So these are the two views that I'll be talking about mostly in Night Talk. And while doing so, I'll be looking at how anthropologists have contributed to the understanding of Himalayas. But before we do that, I'm going to give a short introduction about Himalayas as a physical space. Himalayas, as we know, was formed as a result of a continental drift. The supercontinent in Gondwana land, which was there millions and millions of years ago, which splintered into landmass, which eventually, collided into each other and resulted in upward thrusts of the Earth's surface and resulted in many mountain ranges and also Himalayas. The Himalayas are the youngest mountain range. Geologically, the Himalayas are divided into four areas: the Trans-Himalayas or Tibet, the Greater Himalayas or the high altitude Himalayan region, the lesser or lower Himalayas or the middle Himalayas, and the foothills, Sivalik foothills. And geographically, the Himalayas are divided into three zones or regions: the Western Himalayan region, which consists from Pakistan to Himachal Pradesh and Jammu Kashmir, Ladakh; Central Himalayas, which include Uttarakhand and Nepal; and Eastern Himalayas, which include Sikkim, Darjeeling Himalaya, Bhutan, and Arunachal Pradesh. And it is in Arunachal Pradesh that I conducted my own fieldwork. So to come back to the idea of the romantic Himalayas, what is the romantic Himalayas? So have you ever looked at a tourist brochure which talks about the Himalayas? How the tourist brochures talk about the Himalayas as an unexplored space, as a paradise on earth, as they depicting snowy mountains, misty mountains, peaceful monks, happy people, um, monasteries. So these are the images that continue to circulate even today in travel accounts, in films, in 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 uh, in many everyday assumptions about the Himalayas. And this is not, as I said, this is not an innocent result, but it is the product of what scholar Edward Said calls Orientalism. That means when colonizers came and encountered different world areas in the course of their expansionist missions, they also created knowledge about different world regions in Asia and Africa. And the knowledge production that they did created certain images or certain static images, certain fixed images about the people, about the region. And these images created in that context has now become floating images which continue to dominate our ideas about peoples and places. So these are fixed images that may not have any relation to current realities, or even current realities then, and current realities now, but they continue to actually fascinate and dominate our imagination about the Himalayas. And the external sources about the Himalayas are many early sources, external sources about the Himalayas, which included Indian epics, travelers, Chinese travelers, Greek philosophers, missionaries, and British explorers. And these sources of knowledge about the Himalayas were not completely free of stereotypes. In fact, many of the accounts produced about the Himalayas in these sources were produced without people actually visiting the Himalayas. British rulers were there who went to the Himalayas, but their understanding and the texts that they produced were also based on incomplete understanding of the Himalayas. So the stereotypes that abound even today these sources were not free of those stereotypes that govern our view of the Himalayas, our commonsensical, our common views about the Himalayas today. Till the 1970s, many of the works on the Himalayas were limited to books about Tibetan religion and the political history of Tibet until the Chinese occupation. Most of these books were also not free of stereotypes and some Orientalist notions about the Himalayas and Tibet. Another way in which the Himalayas have been very frequently depicted was the idea of the Himalayas as a frontier. The military history, the international relations lens through which the Himalayas were viewed. So the Himalayas are a frontier that has to be protected, that has to be defended. And very obviously, these books were the result of the India-China border conflict, which began in the 1950s and exploded into war in 1962. And this military history viewpoint of the Himalayas as a frontier to be defended continues even today. And we have very recent productions, 2019, 2020, which talk about the Himalayas as this frontier to be defended. So what is the anthropological view about the Himalayas? In 1963, a piece of writing by an anthropologist called Gerald Berryman, who worked on Nepal, he wrote in the aftermath of the 1962 war that recent events have focused interest on the history, politics, and strategic situation of the Himalayas, but the people of the region has been overlooked. So he has here he has tried to make a case for an anthropological study of the Himalayas. How do we understand the people of the Himalayas going beyond the security point of view, going beyond the point of view of the Himalayas as this romantic, exotic, remote place, fascinating place, but nonetheless, unknown. So we have to go beyond those stereotypes and to go beyond the idea of Himalayas as a military frontier, and to look at and to focus attention on the people who live in this region. So how have anthropologists looked at the Himalayas? Well, there are, again, two ways in which we can understand the anthropological writings about the Himalayas. Anthropology has also fallen into the trap of using the stereotypes about the Himalayas, the romantic Himalaya vision. And this is more so in the till the 1960s, because access to the Himalayan regions were still prohibited, and also there were the assumption within anthropologists too till that time was that one has to go to a remote place, one has to go to the so-called most primitive or the so-called most backward tribe in order to do good anthropology. So doing good anthropology meant that you have to go to a very far off location and try to find most primitive tribes. So that was, again, that is a colonial legacy of anthropology. And in that sense, then, the Himalayas proved or appeared to be a dream, an anthropologist's dream, because if, going by the stereotypes, and the Himalayas are this unknown location, then there must be so many things to discover. So this kind of, discovery impulse, this impulse to discover, which governed anthropology for a long time, definitely contributed to the further circulation of stereotypes about the Himalayas. But the other path that anthropology has taken, and this has been more so after 1970s and 1980s, anthropology is no longer now about studying the most remote. So definitely the criticism about anthropology as being the study of the most remote, the most exotic, that was there to some extent, but no longer now, because anthropologists have become more self-reflexive, more self-critical, and anthropology also has then contributed to breaking certain stereotypes about how remote and unspoiled the Himalayas are. So there are several studies about trade ties, about pilgrimage, about politics, about religious connections that connect the Himalayas with South Asia, with Southeast Asia, with Central Asia. A very famous anthropologist called Christoph von Führer-Himmendorf, who worked in Eastern Himalayas and Central Himalayas in Nepal, where he studied many trading communities. He studied the trans-Himalayan trade, the trade that existed between Tibet, with India, via Kalimpong, via Arunachal Pradesh, via Kashmir, via Nepal, and went on to other parts of Central Asia and even to the west, to Europe and America. Products such as wool, such as salt, Tibetan salt was an important category that was exchanged in the earlier times. So these were these facts of connections that were talked about, that were written about by anthropologists, about the trading worlds, about different kinds of connections that people built through trade. In fact, religious connections, trade routes were one of the ways in which religious ideas were also circulated. Pilgrims also circulated in the trans-Himalayan routes. So these stories of connection were also written about by anthropologists, by their what is called their near experience. That means they went to the field, not distant, but near experience of the field. They went to the Himalayan areas, they spoke to the people, they talked to people, and where there was a dearth of written resources and written sources, they tried to get stories, oral narratives about trade, pilgrimage, politics, and religious connections that actually dispels the myth that Himalayas are this isolated place, are so remote, Because when you talk about relations of trade that had existed for a long time, then how do you even think about the Himalayas as remote or unspoiled? So these were some of the ways in which anthropology has contributed to breaking some of the stereotypes, older stereotypes about the remote Himalayas. An interesting example of trans-Himalayan trade is given in the example of yak tails. Now we know that yak tails are sometimes used in rituals, in religious rituals, and it was also used as the beard or wig for Santa Claus. Now, how did this yak tail, yaks which are a product of high altitude Himalayan areas, how did it reach all these places? Santa Claus and India. So this kind of commodity, the traveling of this commodity, shows how trans-Himalayan trade was there for a long time and dispels actually the notion of the Himalayas as remote. Of course, all these relations of trade, of religion, of culture did become a little interrupted when the 1962 war between India and China took place. So, in a study on traders of Kalimpong, an anthropologist talks about how many of those earlier trade networks that used to be so important, such as Kalimpong, in a trans-Himalayan trade, those became defunct after the 1962 war with India and China, and how those the closure of the cross-border roads also led to the loss of livelihoods for many of these border people for whom cross-border trade was their livelihood. So this is just one example of not just talking about the connections that used to be, but also the connections that were disrupted by geopolitics. So, two ways in which you can understand life in the Himalayas. First, that the Himalayas is a border location, and one cannot understand life in the Himalayas without understanding that life is cross-border life in the Himalayan regions. Because Himalayas, we know, spans 5 countries, and it also spans within India. It spans several state and union territory boundaries. So borders are a fact. Himalayas are a border area, and the formation of nation states, the formation of political units, led to divisions and divisions of lives and livelihoods. But if you have to understand the operation of daily life, then we cannot ignore the fact that life in the Himalayas has to be understood as cross-border life. And the second fact, which is also related to the first, that Himalayas are a border location, is the fact of geopolitics, international relations. How have international relations, the Cold War Cold War that affected ties between US and China, how the policies that were formulated by nation states, how the war between India and China, how that has affected the lives of the communities who live in the border areas. So how have all these international relations, relations between governments, between states, how does that affect the micro level? How does it affect the local lives of the people in the Himalayas? So those two facts, which are again interrelated, they are necessary in order to understand life or daily life or everyday life in the Himalayas. An example here of how cross-border life is a part of Himalayan everyday life. A stretch of land, a stretch of border between Nepal and China. There has always been border crossing in this region. In fact, border crossing is a fact of life in most borders of the world. And in the Himalayan region, it is also the case. So there have been people who have moved across borders for purposes of trade, for purposes of studying in the monastery, in monastic institutes. People from India or other Buddhist regions would go to monasteries in Tibet to study in the monastery institutes. So there was movement across the border for various purposes. Now, after the formation of nation states and after the war especially, many of these movements were stopped, either because of restrictions by China or because of security reasons by the Indian government. I mean, there were several reasons because of which the movement between countries was curtailed. But even after that, uh, it was not possible for even states to stop or completely, limit or curb cross-border movement. And so officials already tried to curb cross-border movement. They found they could not. So in recognition of that, the fact that people would cross over from Nepal to China to Tibetan side of China for daily livelihoods. In recognition of the fact, the Chinese and the Nepal government issued in 2002 border citizen cards for people who lived within 30 kilometers of the border. And this is a recognition of the fact that in the Himalayas, you cannot really impose um, a way of life which is very mainstream, but you have to recognize the local realities and to understand that people cross over as part of their daily life. The second factor, which also is a very important factor in understanding life in the Himalayas, is geopolitics. And in the case of the Indian Himalayan region, geopolitics has meant the relation between India and China, especially a relation that has been dominated by security and the history of war, and also the continuing border conflicts that rise from time to time. So many of the Indian Himalayan regions are areas where roads were built and development was started initially in order to orient those developments to military needs. So the first roads were built in Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh by GREF, the General Reserve Engineering Force of the Indian Army, as part of the military preparations for an impending war. And since then, development has continued to be oriented towards military needs. A helipad, which is built in Tawang, was first built for army purposes and later opened up to civilians. Hospitals and schools are there, but hospitals are also better when they're army hospitals. Often, these army the services, the infrastructures that are built for army do percolate down to civilians. But development has always been primarily oriented towards military needs. So that is a fact of local life. How local development in these areas, in many of these, Indian Himalayan border areas, are oriented towards military needs. And the other thing about geopolitics that I would like to talk about, and I'm going to, this is the last slide because I think I'm nearing 30 minutes. So the other way in which you can think about how geopolitics affects daily lives is in the impact it has on cultural expression and cultural identity. So how do people express their cultural identity? How are people influenced by geopolitics in expressions of cultural identity? So when I was doing my fieldwork in Tawang and West Kameng districts of Arunachal Pradesh, both of these regions are considered to be disputed areas in the sense that China has a claim over these areas, over the whole of Arunachal Pradesh. But these two districts are significant because during the 1962 war, the Chinese troops came and overran this region for almost 2 months, and eventually they withdrew. So the war continues to have cast a shadow over the people of this region, and hence in their expressions of cultural identity too, we find that considerations of geopolitics also enters the picture. And I would like to give the example of how they use their Tibetan Buddhist heritage in their expressions of cultural identity. Many of these areas in the Indian Himalayan borderlands have communities who profess the Tibetan Buddhist faith. So Buddhism traveled to many of these areas through those same circuits by which trade and other commodity and trade commodities also traveled. And now many of these uh, Buddhists in the borderlands are trying to assert a distinct cultural identity. After years of perceived marginalization within their, regional setting, many of these borderland Buddhists are trying to assert their identity and their cultural identity. And in order to assert their cultural identity, they are drawing on these, cultural resources of Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism. But at the same time, because of the geopolitical, shadow, they are not able to explicitly show their allegiance with Tibet. So although they're trying to draw their heritage from Tibetan Buddhism, and but at the same time they have to distance themselves from Tibet. So these are the kind of dynamics, or the kind of negotiations that the people in the borderland have to make, even when they express their cultural identity and even in their local politics. So, in my talk today, I have tried to make these points, the following points: that Himalayas as a region have for a long time been understood through certain stereotypes, certain images, certain romantic visions, which tend to make us believe that it is a remote, out of the way place. It is a place with happy, people, peaceful people, and monks and monasteries. But and I think anthropologists have also contributed to the stereotypes. But at the same time, anthropology is also able, through uh, field studies, to bring to us the stories of the people there about their local lives. And in this local stories and these local accounts of people, we do find that the border location of the Himalayas and geopolitics have an important role to play. So I'm going to end my talk and presentation here. I'll give it over to Maya. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Swargajyoti. That's really, I mean, to me, really fascinating because coming to it from where I am in the media studies department and having been a practicing journalist that's also looked at issues of geopolitics in the region, one of the tools that we have always fallen on to sort of tell the story, and I put that in quotes, is to essentially interact with local communities because it is through their voices that one is able to actually paint a picture of a larger issue that two nation states might be dealing with in high echelons of office in national capitals. But is the person sitting in the national capital who's drafting a policy document even aware of the realities, and not just cultural, but the realities of economic conditions, of ecological conditions, of communities and their interactions, of faith, when they're actually sitting and drafting those documents. So I think it's interesting that you made the point that so much of the development or the focus on development in a lot of these Himalayan borderlands, we're seeing it play out in the news cycle currently as well, has to do with the militarization of that space. And so, as a journalist, if I can ask you, and I hope we can kick off the questions from here, is for you, as somebody who studies the communities, how frustrating is it that in sort of the news cycle, when it comes to the layperson's attention, that do you feel there should be more focus on the stories of the communities? Do you feel that there should be more interaction by policymakers when they come to talk about lands that they have no connections with? How do you bridge that knowledge gap? So, Agajoti, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
Okay. So, since you're from the media world, I'd also actually, talk about the lack of a print media in many of these areas that we talk about. And I say this because the media has a big role to play in bringing the stories of the local people to the mainstream. In fact, when I was starting my research in Tawang and West Kameng, and that was
Mm-hmm.
like 2007, I found out that there was a movement for autonomy that was, developing at that time. And it was a movement that was for autonomy for Tawang and West Kameng districts. But it was not at all, highlighted in the national media. And this is not a comment on the media. It is also about the comment of how knowledge and information finds it difficult to travel to more mainstream spaces. And it's also a matter about infrastructure and how printing presses are not there. So I think it's very important that policymakers and political representatives actually travel to these areas, try to find out what the people want, what is it, what are the grievances, and try to sort out. And this applies to all the situations, not just border situations, but try to find out what are the grievances of people, and why do people do what they do? Why do people say what they say? Why are people in Tawang and West Kameng, fighting for autonomy? What is it that is trying to? What is it that is leading to that kind of unrest and turmoil and concerns among the people? So I agree actually about what you said about the need for dialogue and the need for communication channels to remain open. And I feel
Hmm.
that in Tawang, which is a border location, so it's very sensitive. Um it's very difficult for people to also openly express many things, which might include their ties with the Tibetan world. So there is a lot of uh, geopolitics, which also impacts the expression of local politics. And this is something that has to be written about, that has to be understood better. And uh, uh, and yeah, I think both media and anthropology can definitely play a role in doing this.
Okay, and just in terms of your fieldwork, as we wait for more questions to come in, and I'm urging all the attendees over here to please put in your questions in the question and answer box. We'll take them in. We'll put them in clusters as we get them, and we'll take them for discussion. But when you interact with local communities, as I presume you do continue to do so as part of your fieldwork, how do they respond to the changing geopolitics, the sort of top down changes that may take place that impact them? Is there a sense from them that there needs to be less focus on militarization, because the militarization has also led to roads and communications networks and infrastructure in far flung places? I stumble on that all the time. Or do they feel that there's too much of a heavy price that they have paid um, for this development, a price of like overall community neglect?
Right. Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question. I think in Arunachal Pradesh and in the border location, as in many of the border areas of India, we do not see too much of uh, we actually find the politics of the areas quite aligned with the politics of the center, and which means to say, by which I mean to say that uh, people tend to accommodate rather than confront the government at the center, because it is their understanding that they can get to uh, they can get the benefits of state, and they can also get the uh, development packages of the state if they are aligned with the government. So that has been always a feature of the politics of many of these border regions. Having said that, I think unlike many other parts of India where there is permanent militarization and there has been a conflicted kind of relation between the local population and the military, it is not the case in Tawang and West Kameng, where the military, and this is also something that is also a case in Kargil. There are anthropologists who have written about this. They call it heart warfare. That means heart warfare in the sense that the military has tried to win over the hearts of the people by involving themselves in various work like services, infrastructure, some kind of development services, trying to help the people. So they have conducted hard warfare, because even the Indian state and the military know that in order to keep it's important to hold on to the border areas through various um, strategies of trying to win them over. So the military in Arunachal Pradesh has also not had a conflicted relation with the local population. There have been problems of problems when military settled on local land, used up local land for firing ranges, tried to use land for establishing military camps, and did not compensate the people enough. And so there were disputes about that, about less compensation, but we do not see the relations as turning as aggressive or confrontational as we see in some other places where there is militarization. And more or less there is accommodation of the state attitude and state stance rather than confrontation in this border areas.
Right. Okay. We've got a few questions coming in. In fact, Pratya is asking an interesting question that, when your research is published, and I think this kind of takes back to my question earlier as well, which is about the kind of knowledge gaps and the bridging. Someone like you who's studying these communities, who is an anthropologist working on these issues, do you take back your research and what your findings are to the communities who you interact with? And in fact, if you do, how do you go about it? Is there a procedure? Are there norms for something like this? How do you do that?
I'm very glad that this question has been asked, because I can air a personal kind of complaint against India Post by doing so. So one way in which we can give back to the communities is by sharing knowledge, and how do we reciprocate by giving the products of what we write, our writing, our books. So I tried to do that by giving two copies of my books to the libraries in the local areas like Tawang and West Kamang, and I posted two copies of my book to the local libraries, and they got lost in India Post. So I'm very happy that this is and I have launched a complaint, and I really hope that this can be solved. But to be to but so the ethics of doing anthropology is that we can acknowledge the role of our local interlocutors in knowledge production. So anthropology has for a long time, anthropology was a discipline that claimed that the anthropologists were experts, were creating knowledge about the field that they went to study. But knowledge production is not as straightforward as that. You don't just go to the field and collect knowledge and collect data and come back and write up. When you are going to the field, you talk to people. So your interpretations of the field are also interpretations that are given by other people. So they are like first or second hand information and interpretations that we have. And so we have to acknowledge the role of the people with whom we talk in our knowledge production. So I think that's a very important and ethical standpoint that we have to make, that this is what we have produced, what we write is not something that I write. It's not my sole authorship, but it's a shared authorship that I need to acknowledge. So that's I think important to point that all anthropologists must acknowledge.
Right. Okay. We move on to the next question, which is whether we can really be confident enough to consider all non-colonial representations of the Himalayas as free from being Orientalist, especially when Orientalism is less about a lived Orient as such, but about a space that got sort of discursively formed. That's an interesting question from Swata Siddha Sarkar to the panelists, to you, Swargajyoti. So, I mean, do you want to take that on? The notion of the Orientalist view?
Sure. And thank you for that question. That's a very important question. I agree that no, we are not at all free of colonial stereotypes. We're not at all free of Orientalist stereotypes. In fact, that's part of our everyday life. And I agree that Orientalism is not just about lived Orient, it's a way of thinking. And it's a way of thinking that's not just limited to the disciplines or to academic discourse, but it has become free of the texts that created them. These images of the Himalayas as mystical, as exotic, that's free now of the original text that created them, and they've become kind of all in the air. They're now circulating all around. They're free floating, and they dominate the way we think. So Orientalism, we're all Orientalists in that sense, if we subscribe to those stereotypes. So because it's a way of thinking, it's not really just a body of text anymore. It's a way of thinking. So anybody can be an Orientalist if we subscribe to those stereotypes. And anthropologists can also fall prey to such stereotypes. And so another, I think, ethical standpoint that anthropologists need to take is that we all have biases. We all have our subjective biases, and so nobody can really be free of any of these subjective biases. But what we can do is to try and be aware of these biases that may be there in all of us, because we come from different backgrounds, from different cultural backgrounds, regional backgrounds. But we can be at least we can be aware of those biases and try to minimize them, and not claim objectivity in representation, because whatever we claim as objective is not objective. And if we try to sell them as objective knowledge, that is doing also a disservice to knowledge. So yes, I agree with Satasita.
Okay, there are two questions that are kind of linked to something I touched upon earlier, which is about the militarization of these spaces. So Datta is asking how local communities react and interact with the military presence in their midst. And I think you alluded to some of that interaction, but if you could expand on that. And also, as a corollary to that, Rohit is asking whether the shadow of geopolitics and the overrepresentation of the military in all these regions has had an impact on entrepreneurship, on local journalism, and whether that can change.
Okay, thank you for the questions. So the first question, as you said, Maya, I think I've already, answered the question about relations between the local
Yeah.
people and the military. There are many things that one can, talk about the local relations, the local military relations, being smooth and hunky dory on the surface, but there are many subterranean, tendencies, many currents that are also there. For example, the the practice of renaming local areas with army given names. That actually sometimes is a very spontaneous process where army settlements go and then start calling a place which in this areas where places have Tibetic names. So trying to rename those places, and that has definitely led to a loss of or effacing of cultural identity and cultural landscape. So that has definitely been one of those uh, ramifications of army settlement. And Hindi, the prevalence of Hindi in the areas, everybody takes it for granted. In fact, it is one of the means by which I too used to communicate. But that definitely has again led to cultural loss. So these more silent maybe consequences. They don't really manifest as aggressive encounter between the local people and the military, but these are more silent consequences of militarization in the border areas. And the second question is about the state of entrepreneurship and local journalism in the region. That's actually increasing. And I think also thanks to social media, a lot of people are starting social media pages, and that has created local knowledge, not external knowledge, but local knowledge from the region, and that has been very helpful and important. So I so the shadow of geopolitics of the region is also a function of the overrepresentation of the military. Sure, that's true. I think it's the military presence definitely is something that's that hits you when you go to the area. It's something that you cannot avoid. So I would not really say it's overrepresentation, but maybe the presence of the army is definitely a shadow of the geopolitics. And at least in this region, I'm not sure how uh, soon this is going to change. There can be changes because of tourism, the tourist industry, ecotourism, cultural tourism, Buddhist tourism. All these things are definitely, changing to landscape. But this is also a very tense process. On the one hand, in 2015, the Prime Minister inaugurated the railways to Arunachal Pradesh. So this was to boost tourism. And in fact, the restrictions for foreign citizens or even for Indian citizens, the permits that are required, some restrictions were also loosened for many of the border areas in Northeast India, including Arunachal Pradesh. But this has also actually created some concern among the local people that with the coming of the local of the railways or with the relaxation of these entry permits, will there be an influx, because this is a kind of overriding concern, that will there be influx and will there be people who are going to come from outside, take up land and livelihood, and also lead to cultural loss. So this is still a back and forth kind of dialogue, and I'm not sure how soon this will change, but definitely there is change through tourism.
Okay, we have actually a very interesting question from one of the attendees, Praveen Kumar, who's asking whether other states which are sort of part of the Himalayan terrain as well, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, which are relatively close to Delhi in terms of distance and proximity, both political and geographical, whether their dynamic as mountain communities is different from the kinds of communities that you've seen and studied in the more distant areas of the Himalayan region, of the borders, of the northeast, of Ladakh, of places like that. And I think linked to this is also another question which you can tackle is on the ecological issues and the issues of climate change and the environment. I mean, how much of this is a priority for these communities? How much of it is linked to their livelihoods, and then again that kind of influences decision making and things like that. So
Okay, so the first question about Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand, I think the Himalayas are very diverse, not just in terms of terrain, high Himalaya, great Himalayas, middle Himalayas, and so on. In terms of diverse, in terms of biodiversity, diverse in terms of culture, languages. Himalayas are not just Buddhist. Himalayas are Islamic. Himalayas are Hindus. Himalayas are Christian. There are lots of diversity in the Himalayas, and there is also diversity in the way people have experienced uh, the changes, which include nation states, new nation states, and there have been writings. So, if we look at the Himalayas, of course, there are different areas, and some people who are nearer to the plains maybe might have fared slightly better. But again, the the generic word, Pahari, that's used for people in the areas, Uttarakhand, high, there is still a there is still a sense of marginalization, because although the people general in this blanket term Pahari, they're also Hindus. There are differences between their practices and the caste Hindu practices of the plains, so that has definitely created some sense of marginalization. Then, of course, there were the experience of the Himalayan, pastoralists, the Himalayan people who used to practice animal husbandry, people who used forest resources. So, imposition of state laws and policies on the traditional practices of the people have affected them. So the experiences have been different, definitely, across the Himalayas, but there are experiences even in these, places, although they might not be the same kind of experiences that are faced by Ladakh or Arunachal Pradesh and more high altitude Himalayas. But there are experiences that I think can be understood through marginalization, through the perspective of, through the lens of marginalization. And the other
okay, and I
question,
think that yeah, there was the other question part. The other part of this was on the ecological balance and the priorities um, of that for the communities.
okay, just take a quick minute to read this.
Yeah, how climate change and environmental issues affect communities in the borderlands, and they're just asking you your thoughts on that.
Okay. Yes, that's definitely there. In fact, we read about how um, there the developments, infrastructural, um, developments across the border uh, are threatening the lives of people, the lands, the rivers of people in the Himalayas. So this is definitely an area of concern, and we need to think about different way of looking at cross-border cooperation when you look at ecological process in climate change, because I think environment is a very interconnected process. So one cannot really think about the Himalayan environment as just limited to uh, you know the Indian Himalayas. I mean, environment itself is a interconnected system. So, in order to answer these questions, I think one has to definitely go beyond local communities, and definitely one has to look at the role of governments. One cannot really, make this a very local concern, because one has to not just look at governments but intergovernmental relations, definitely, in order to also understand and deal with the environmental issues in the Himalayas.
Right. Okay. And I think we have time just for our last question. There are two, but I'm going to club them together because one attendee was asking whether you could have, whether there's more to say on spiritual identities of these communities and how they are linked, not linked. I mean, the different strands of Buddhism alone is another research area in and of itself in these parts. But on different spiritual identities, and of course, in Indian mythology, the role of the Himalayas in epics. In mythology, yeah, how much of that comes up in your research?
Okay, yeah. So my own research will deals more with the politics of culture. There is of course a fertile ground to explore about representations of the Himalayas, representations of the Himalayas in mythologies, and uh, how there are actually interesting writings about the Hindu views of the Himalayas and uh, Buddhist views of the Himalayas. So there is definitely ground scope for exploring all these different representations. But my work mostly deals with Buddhist identity,
Hmm.
and that doesn't mean that the Himalayas is only Buddhist. So this is a very important actually point. The Himalayas actually have Islam, Himalayas have Hindus, Himalayas have a lot of other things. But in my work, I looked at how the Himalayas were actually reformulated and are being reconceptualized as Buddhist Himalayas as a process of cultural identity formation by the Buddhist of the Himalayan area. So Himalaya becomes Buddhist in their representation. So what is the politics of that? That is what my research concerns.
Right, Swargajyoti, I think that's really fascinating, and I look forward to actually more engagement with you on this because I come back to what I started with, which is right now the kind of space that we're in terms of just the national news media. You have an opportunity in some way to actually bring a region of the South Asian geography into a sort of front and center news cycle kind of way. People are talking about the Himalayas right now and all aspects and all facets of it, primarily in the context of militarization and national boundaries. But I think along with that come up so many other questions that people are interested in, and it's an opportunity perhaps to bring some of your research and your study out into the public domain. So I think this was a really fascinating talk, and I thank you for having taken the time. Wait, I've got a question and answer box with one more question in it. We have about 3 minutes left, so maybe we can try and take that in as your final question, which is one by Ranjini Sen, who's asking whether you take into cognizance oral histories of the region while doing your research. I presume a lot of your research comes from oral histories and oral telling in terms of interviews as well. But maybe you have some interesting anecdotes and insights to share with the audience as we conclude this talk?
Yes, I think oral history is a very important source where there are not many written records. And when I was first going to doing when I started doing research in that area, I tried to go to all the people who are in the 70s or 80s, so that I could talk to them and get their understanding of how it was during Tibetan times. So I don't know if I mentioned this, but the region where I worked was part of Tibet almost for 300 years until the British came and drew the Indo-Tibetan boundary. But there were people who were 70s in the 80s at that time who had actually experienced this transition from Tibetan rule to British rule and then to Indian post-colonial Indian rule. So it was for me very interesting to go and speak to the elderly people and try to get the sense of how they experienced Tibetan rule and then the transition to British rule and then Indian rule. So the viewpoints, it was very interesting for me to get. So oral history cannot be a source of a single source of information when we're doing anthropology. We have to use, or what we call triangulate, we have to use different sources of information. So oral history could be one. We could also have interviews, we could also have conversations, we could also use secondary sources and archival resources. So anthropology is anthropology in the sense that it is contemporary, but it can use a variety of sources, film, journalism, different kinds of literature, in order to actually shape the particular kind of direction that one wants to take anthropological research. But you can use variety of resources, and oral history is one of the methods, but not the only one.
Right. Thank you so much, Swargajyoti. I think we're done with our time on this session, so we'll have to conclude it there. Pratyay, is there something you'd like to share with us as we conclude this session as well? Because we know that this is something you're trying to do in terms of getting Ashoka's faculty and their research and their methods and their interactions out there. I think it's a very important a resource, not just for our students, but for a wider community that's interested it doesn't have to be just academic pursuits, but looking at issues through the lens of research. And I think that's very important. So Pratyay says, no, that's it. That's it from me and from you, Swargajyoti. So thank you all very much for being a part of today's edition of Beyond the Classroom. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Maya. I look forward to more interactions with you, and thank you for steering this discussion so well. Thank you to Proctor and Akshay. Thank you.
Likewise. Bye.
Bye. So, can I leave? Okay. Bye then.